Blood is thicker than water, but it burns a lot worse when it's spitting venom. For 24 years, my father looked at me like I was the dirt on the bottom of his polished Italian leather shoes. To him, I was just a lowly grunt, a miserable enlisted failure who threw away a trust fund to crawl in the mud. But the thing about mud is, it teaches you how to stay dead still before you pull the trigger. If you look up the word narcissist in the dictionary, you probably wouldn't see a picture of Richard Patterson. You'd see a portrait, oil on canvas, naturally, commissioned by himself, hanging in the foyer of his 8,000 square foot estate in Connecticut. My father is the CEO of Patterson Defense Solutions, a boutique private contracting and weapons manufacturing firm that caters to the elite, the paranoid, and the obscenely wealthy. He is a man who measures human worth in two distinct metrics, the commas in your bank account and the brass on your collar. Growing up, there was only one acceptable path in the Patterson household. You were expected to be brilliant, you were expected to be ruthless, and above all, you were expected to be a leader. My older sister, Abigail, understood the assignment flawlessly. She went to Wharton, got her MBA, and stepped right into the vice president of marketing role at our father's company. She drove a Porsche 911, wore designer suits that cost more than most people make in a month, and never missed a Sunday brunch at the country club. She was the golden child, the heir apparent, and then there was me, Alice. I was the glitch in Richard Patterson's perfectly coded legacy. I hated the boardrooms. I despised the country club and the fake, plastic smiles of the billionaires who sipped mimosas while discussing the geopolitical conflicts that padded their portfolios. When I was 18, my father handed me an acceptance letter to Yale and a brochure for an elite officer training program. He had called in every favor, greased every wheel, to ensure I would walk out as a commissioned officer. It was his grand design. Abigail would handle the corporate side, and I would be his shining star in the Pentagon, pushing his contracts through the military bureaucracy. Instead, I took the Yale acceptance letter, put it through the paper shredder in his home office, and drove down to the local recruiting station. I enlisted in the United States Army as a regular, standard-issue, enlisted grunt. The day I told him, the temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. I will never forget the look of sheer, unadulterated disgust that contorted his face. "You enlisted?" he had sneered, the word tasting like poison in his mouth. "You threw away an Ivy League education to become a bullet catcher? A lowly private scrubbing toilets in a motor pool? You are a Patterson, Alice. We do not take orders from the middle class. We give them. I want to do something real. Dad," I had replied, my voice shaking but my resolve ironclad. "I want to earn my place, not have it bought for me." He laughed, a cold, hollow sound. "Real? You think being a nameless, faceless pawn in a uniform is real? You're making the biggest mistake of your life. Don't come crying to me when you realize you're nothing but cannon fodder." That was 6 years ago. I didn't go crying to him. I went to basic training. I went to infantry school. I learned what it felt like to be so exhausted your bones hummed, what it felt like to freeze in the rain and bake in the sun. I learned how to rely on the person to my left and my right. I earned my rank as a specialist. But more importantly, I found my calling. I had a natural, almost terrifying aptitude for ballistics, while other soldiers struggled to calculate windage and elevation under pressure. The math formed in my head like a second language. The recoil of a rifle wasn't a violent kick to me. It was a rhythmic pulse. I was quietly sent to the squad-designated marksman course, and later, through a grueling sniper selection. I didn't tell my family any of this. To my father, I was still just Alice, the enlisted failure. Whenever we were forced to interact at holidays, he introduced me to his wealthy friends with a thinly veiled sneer. "This is my youngest. She's going through a very long, very tedious rebellious phase in the Army. We're hoping she grows out of it soon and gets a real job." The breaking point, the moment that set the stage for the greatest reckoning of my life, began with an email from my company commander, Captain Reynolds. Our unit was stationed out west, and we had just received an invitation to the Lone Star Tactical Invitational in Nevada. It was a massive, high-profile charity shooting event, heavily sponsored by private defense contractors, designed to mix elite military units with wealthy civilian donors. It was half competition, half networking circus. And the primary sponsor? Patterson Defense Solutions. Captain Reynolds, knowing my last name, called me into his office. Specialist Patterson, I see your father's company is hosting the invitational next month. The brass wants us to send a 4-man element to represent the battalion. I want you on that team. I felt a cold knot form in my stomach. Sir, with all due respect, my father and I don't exactly see eye to eye. My presence there might cause friction. Captain Reynolds leaned back, his eyes narrowing. Patterson, you are the best shot in this battalion, and I don't care whose feelings get hurt. We are going there to show these corporate suits what real soldiers look like. You deploy with Staff Sergeant Miller, Corporal Bradley, and Private First Class Jenkins. That's an order. Yes, sir, I said. That night, my phone rang. The caller ID flashed Richard Patterson. I stared at it for 3 rings before answering. I saw the roster for the invitational. My father's voice came through the speaker, crisp and arrogant. I see your commander decided to drag you along. I suppose they need someone to carry the ammunition. Hello to you too, Dad. I sighed, rubbing my temples. Listen to me very carefully, Alice, he said, his tone dropping to a warning whisper. This event is critical for my new defense contracts. The governor will be there. Jonathan Hayes will be there. I am hosting generals, not grunts. I expect you to stay out of the way, keep your mouth shut, and not embarrass me. Is that understood? I'm going there to shoot, Dad, just like everyone else. He scoffed loudly. Shoot? Please. Leave the precision work to the adults. Just stand in the background and look like a good little soldier. Don't humiliate yourself, and more importantly, don't humiliate me. He hung up. I lowered the phone, staring at the blank screen. A slow, quiet fire ignited in my chest. For 6 years, I had taken his insults. I had swallowed my pride for the sake of family peace. But this time he was on my turf. The Nevada desert in mid-July is a brutal, unforgiving environment. The heat doesn't just surround you, it sits on your chest and pushes the air out of your lungs. The air above the asphalt tarmac of the Copperhead Tactical Range shimmered with mirages, distorting the jagged mountains in the distance. But my father hadn't spared a single expense to make the desert bow to his will. Massive, air-conditioned, VIP tents lined the perimeter of the 1,500-yard shooting range. Waitstaff in crisp white shirts and black ties carried trays of iced water and hors d'oeuvres, past tables loaded with some of the most expensive, highly customized firearms on the planet. It looked less like a military range and more like a country club that had accidentally ordered a shipment of sniper rifles. I arrived in a dusty Humvee with Staff Sergeant Miller, Corporal Bradley, and PFC Jenkins. We were wearing standard-issue OCPs, operational camouflage pattern. Boots scuffed, sleeves rolled up. We looked exactly like what we were, working-class soldiers. Look at this circus, Bradley muttered, stepping out of the vehicle and adjusting his patrol cap. I feel like I need to pay an entry fee just to breathe the air. Keep your heads on a swivel and your mouths shut, Sergeant Miller instructed, his eyes scanning the opulent setup. We're here to shoot our blocks, represent the unit, and leave. Don't get drawn into the rich kid games. He cast a sideways glance at me. Patterson, you good? I'm fine, Sergeant, I said, slinging my heavy Pelican case out of the back. Inside was my issued M110 semi-automatic sniper system. It wasn't painted in a fancy Cerakote finish. It didn't have gold inlays or a custom carbon fiber stock. It was scratched, worn, and had the faint smell of carbon and CLP oil. But I knew every single millimeter of that weapon. It was an extension of my own arm. As we walked toward the registration table, a golf cart zipped out from behind a VIP tent and screeched to a halt in front of us. Out stepped my father. He was wearing a perfectly tailored tactical polo shirt that probably cost $500, designer sunglasses, and custom-molded electronic ear protection resting casually around his neck. He looked like an actor playing a contractor in a Hollywood movie. Behind him stepped Jonathan Hayes, a billionaire tech investor and my father's biggest financial backer. Jonathan was a notorious blowhard who treated life like a giant frat party he was funding. Well, well, my father said, clapping his hands together slowly. The cavalry has arrived, looking a bit dusty, aren't we? Mr. Patterson, Sergeant Miller said, giving a polite, neutral nod. My father ignored him completely, locking his eyes on me. Alice, I see you brought your little friends. He turned to Jonathan, a patronizing smile plastering his face. Jonathan, this is my youngest daughter, Alice, the one I told you about. She's roughing it. Finding herself in the enlisted ranks, Jonathan looked me up and down, clearly unimpressed by my lack of shiny hardware. Right, the Grunt. Nice to meet you. Kid, make sure you drink plenty of water out here. Wouldn't want you passing out and ruining your dad's big day. I felt Bradley stiffen next to me, but I shot him a sharp look. Do not engage. We'll be fine, Mr. Hayes, I said evenly. We're used to the heat. Sure you are, my father chuckled dismissively. He gestured toward a massive, custom-built rifle resting on a velvet-lined display rack nearby. Come here, Alice, let me show you what real engineering looks like. Maybe you can take some notes back to your quartermaster. He led us to the table. The gun was absurd. It was a custom-chambered .338 Lapua Magnum with a titanium receiver, a barrel fluted so aggressively it looked like a drill bit, and a scope that cost more than my first car. 3 pounds lighter than standard. Custom trigger pull set at exactly 1.2 pounds, my father boasted, practically petting the weapon. I'm hitting a 10-inch plate at 1,000 yards with this beauty. It takes the guesswork out of the wind. Of course, you need to understand advanced ballistics to really appreciate it. What did the Army give you to play with today? Let me guess. A beat-up M4 with a red dot? I brought what I need, I said, keeping my voice flat. Well, my father sighed, looking at my locked Pelican case with pity. Just try to keep your shots on your own target. Alice, don't embarrass the family name. The governor is arriving in an hour, and I don't need you looking like a confused amateur when the cameras are rolling. He patted my shoulder, a condescending, heavy pat, and walked away, laughing at something Jonathan said. Sergeant Miller stepped up beside me, his jaw tight. Permission to speak freely. Specialist? Granted, Sergeant. Your old man is a piece of work. You have no idea. Sergeant, I murmured, gripping the handle of my case. Let's go set up. The morning consisted of the standard dog and pony show. Politicians made speeches, giant novelty checks were handed to veterans' charities, and a lot of wealthy men strutted around the firing line talking loudly about their expensive toys. My squad and I stayed at the far end of the firing line, quietly running through our drills. We zeroed our optics, checked our dope, data on previous engagements, and read the shifting desert winds. The wind out here was tricky. It was a fishtailing crosswind, blowing left to right near the firing line, but swirling upward near the mountains at the end of the range. It was the kind of wind that made amateur shooters look foolish and broke the hearts of professionals. Around 1 p.m., the announcer's voice echoed over the PA system. Ladies and gentlemen, we will now begin the 500-yard precision exhibition. Shooters, please take the line. This was the warm-up before the main event. A crowd of about 300 people, VIPs, media, and other competitors, gathered behind the firing line. The bleachers were packed. My father and Jonathan Hayes took the center lanes. They were flanked by their private spotters, former special ops guys they had hired for the weekend to read the wind for them. It was a pathetic display of purchased competence. My father didn't need to know how to shoot. He just needed to pull the trigger when his hired help told him to. Sergeant Miller nudged me. Patterson, get up there. Lane 7. I unlatched my Pelican case and lifted the heavy, matte black M110. I slid a 20-round magazine into my pouch, grabbed my shooting mat, and walked up to lane 7, 3 spots down from my father. As I lay down on the mat and deployed my bipod, I could feel my father's eyes on me. "Look who decided to join the adults," he called out loudly, ensuring the people in the bleachers behind us could hear. "Careful with the recoil. Alice, that standard issue junk likes to kick." A few of his corporate buddies chuckled. I ignored them. I peered through my loopholed scope, dialing in my elevation. 500 yards. For me, that wasn't a challenge. That was a chip shot. It was practically point-blank range. "Shooters, you have 5 rounds. Fire at will," the range master called out. My father's hired spotter whispered in his ear. "Wind is 3 miles per hour. Full value from the left. Hold left edge." My father settled behind his $10,000 rifle. Boom. The heavy 338 Lapua round tore down the range. A second later, a loud ping echoed back. He had hit the steel silhouette. "Dead center," Jonathan cheered, clapping my dad on the back. "Beautiful shot, Richard." My father fired 4 more times, hitting the steel each time. The crowd applauded enthusiastically. He stood up, popping his ear protection off his ears, beaming with a smug, self-satisfied grin. He looked down the line at me. I hadn't fired a single shot yet. I was just watching the dust kick up downrange, mapping the invisible currents of the wind in my mind. "What's the matter, Alice?" my father mocked, his voice carrying over the quiet range. "Forget how to take the safety off, or are you just realizing you're a little out of your depth? It's okay to step down. No shame in admitting you don't belong here." The crowd murmured. I could feel the eyes of the governor, the generals, and my own squad burning into my back. Sergeant Miller was standing 10 feet behind me, his arms crossed, his face an unreadable mask of stone. But I saw his fingers tap his bicep, our subtle unit signal for "light them up." I exhaled slowly, watching the mirage waves dance above the dirt. I didn't use a spotter. I didn't need one. I flipped the selector switch from safe to semi. I pulled the stock tight into the pocket of my shoulder, letting my breathing sink with the pounding of my heart. I didn't hold my breath. I rode the natural respiratory pause at the bottom of my exhale. Crack, 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 crack. I fired all 5 rounds in less than 3 seconds. The rapid succession of the 7.62 Mina rounds echoed like a drum roll across the desert. The range went dead silent. Down at the 500-yard berm, my steel target was swinging violently on its chains. But there weren't 5 distinct impacts scattered across the plate. Through the spotting scopes, the crowd could see it. I hadn't just hit the center of the target. I had put all 5 rounds through the exact same 2-inch hole, right where the painted heart of the silhouette used to be. The grouping was so tight the bullets had practically cannibalized each other. I flipped the weapon back to safe, kept my eyes downrange, and didn't move a muscle. Behind me, Corporal Bradley let out a low, impressed whistle. My father stared downrange through his binoculars, his jaw tightening. He lowered the optics, refusing to look impressed. Instead, he forced a dry, dismissive laugh. "Well," he announced to his friends, waving his hand. "Beginner's luck. The wind is completely dead right now. Anybody could group shots in a vacuum. Let's see what happens when we push it out to the real distances." He turned back to me, his eyes cold and furious that I hadn't embarrassed myself. "Don't get cocky, little girl. 500 yards is child's play. The real test is the ironclad challenge, and I promise you, that little army toy of yours won't even make it halfway." The PA system crackled to life again. "Ladies and gentlemen, the warm-up is over. We are now moving to the ironclad long-range challenge. The distance is 200 yards. The current range record is 3 confirmed hits in 60 seconds. Shooters, prepare yourselves. The wind is picking up." I looked at the flags downrange. They were snapping violently now. The wind wasn't dead anymore. It was waking up, turning angry and unpredictable. My father walked back to his customized rifle, his face a mask of arrogant determination. He was about to try and break the record in front of the governor, the generals, and his billionaire friends. He was about to try and prove that money could buy mastery. I stayed on the ground, my finger resting gently against the trigger guard. Let him try, I thought, a cold smile finally touching my lips. Let him try to buy the wind. The ironclad long-range challenge wasn't just a shooting competition. It was a psychological pressure cooker designed to break egos. At 200 yards, the target, an 18-inch steel diamond, looked smaller than the head of a pin to the naked eye. At that distance, you aren't just shooting a bullet, you are launching a tiny piece of metal on a parabolic flight path through invisible rivers of air. You have to account for the curvature of the Earth. You have to calculate spin drift, the phenomenon where the rifling of the barrel naturally pulls the bullet to the right. And then there was the Nevada wind. By 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the desert had turned into a convection oven. Thermals were rising violently off the scorching asphalt, creating a thick, rippling mirage that made the targets downrange look like they were dancing underwater. The wind flags were a schizophrenic nightmare. At the 300-yard line, the flag was blowing stiffly to the left. At 800 yards, it hung dead straight. And at 100 yards, right before the target, a nasty crosswind was whipping the nylon fabric to the right. The announcer's voice echoed across the tense firing line. The rules are simple. Shooters have exactly 60 seconds from their first shot to land as many confirmed impacts as possible on the 200-yard diamond. The current record IXM, held since 2022, is 3 impacts. Mr. Richard Patterson, lane 4, you are up. A polite murmur of applause rippled through the VIP bleachers. Governor David Harrison leaned forward in his front row seat, shielding his eyes from the glare. While General Thomas Mitchell, a legendary 2-star who had served in Fallujah, watched with a skeptical, steely gaze, my father settled onto his plush shooting mat, looking every inch the corporate warlord. Next to him was his hired spotter, Wyatt Sullivan. Wyatt was a former Navy SEAL, a guy who had sold his soul to the private sector and now made a small fortune carrying my father's bags and reading his wind. Wyatt had an array of gadgets laid out beside him that looked like the control console of a spaceship, a Kestrel 5700 Elite weather meter, a ballistic computer, and a spotting scope that cost more than my entire squad's yearly salary. "All right, Richard," Wyatt muttered, his voice carrying slightly in the hushed silence. Density altitude is sitting at 4,200 feet. The thermals are boiling. We've got a left-to-right full value at the target, but it's swirling in the middle. Dial your elevation up 10.4 mils. Hold left 2.5 mils for the wind. My father didn't question it. He just mechanically spun the expensive turrets on his custom 3338 Lapua Magnum. He didn't know the math. He was just a puppet pulling a trigger. "Ready when you are," my father said, his voice dripping with unearned confidence. "Send it," Wyatt commanded. Boom! The massive rifle roared, kicking up a cloud of fine and talcum powder dust around my father's elbows. The massive .338 bullet tore through the sound barrier, hurtling across the desert. At 1,200 yards, the flight time was nearly 2 full seconds. The crowd held its collective breath, waiting for the metallic ping of a hit. Silence. "Miss," Wyatt called out sharply, his eye glued to the glass. "You were high right. The wind dropped out at the 800-yard line right as you pulled the trigger. The bullet sailed. Come down 0.5 mil. Hold left 1.5. Fire quickly before it shifts again." My father cursed under his breath, violently cycling the bolt. The brass casing flew out, glinting in the sun. He jammed his shoulder back into the stock. Boom. 1 second. 2 seconds. Ping. A faint, distant ringing sound drifted back to the firing line. "Hit!" the announcer yelled. The crowd cheered. Governor Harrison clapped politely. "All right, that's one," Wyatt said, his voice tightening. "You have 40 seconds left. The wind is picking up again. It's gusting. Hold left 3 mils." My father rushed the bolt. He was visibly sweating now, the pressure of the ticking clock cracking his arrogant veneer. He didn't pause to let his breathing settle. He just yanked the trigger. Boom! Silence. Miss. Low and left. You jerked the trigger. Richard, Wyatt barked, dropping the professional courtesy. You've got 20 seconds. Reset your breathing. Wind is holding. Left 3 mils. Don't tell me I jerked the trigger, my father snapped back, his face turning a blotchy red. The barrel is getting too hot. It's throwing the harmonics off. Just shoot the gun. Richard, 10 seconds. My father fired his 4th shot. Silence. Miss. He frantically cycled the bolt, tearing the skin off his knuckle on the scope mount in his haste. He fired a 5th, desperate shot just as the buzzer blared. Miss. Time, the announcer called out. Mr. Patterson finishes with 1 confirmed impact. A smattering of sympathetic applause pattered from the corporate sycophants. My father stood up, his face a storm of pure, unadulterated rage. He didn't thank Wyatt. Instead, he kicked his expensive shooting mat, muttering darkly about defective ammunition and poorly calibrated scopes. He stalked back toward the shade of the VIP tent, grabbing a bottle of water from a terrified-looking server. As he passed Jonathan Hayes, he sneered. The wind is impossible right now. Nobody is hitting that plate more than once. The atmospheric conditions are completely unstable. Jonathan nodded in agreement, wiping his brow. You got a hit, Richard. That's more than most of these weekend warriors will do. The record is safe. I was sitting on an ammo crate, quietly checking the torque on my scope rings. My father caught my eye. The embarrassment of his failure morphed instantly into cruelty. Don't even bother unpacking that government-issue garbage. Alice, he called out, loudly enough for General Mitchell to hear. At 200 yards, your little 7.62 round is going to drop like a stone. It'll be subsonic by 900 yards. You're going to be lobbing bullets into the dirt. Save yourself the humiliation and withdraw. Sergeant Miller stepped up beside me, his eyes locked on my father. Specialist Patterson doesn't withdraw. Mr. Patterson, my father scoffed. Then I hope you brought a shovel. Sergeant, because she's going to be digging her bullets out of the dirt halfway down the range. I stood up, closing my toolkit with a sharp snap. I didn't look at my father. I looked at the shimmering, hostile expanse of the Nevada desert. Sergeant Miller, I said calmly, grab the glass. We're up. Walking to the firing line felt like walking to an execution block, but I was the executioner. The whispers in the crowd were palpable. I was the only enlisted soldier competing in the Ironclad Challenge, and I was carrying a weapon that everyone in the military knew was never designed for this distance. The M110 semi-automatic sniper system fires a 7.62 51mm NATO round. It is a highly effective, incredibly lethal weapon out to about 800 yards. Pushing it to 1,000 yards is considered a masterclass in ballistics. Pushing it to 200 yards is widely considered an exercise in futility. Because of the relatively light weight of the bullet, it loses velocity fast. Around 900 yards, the bullet drops below the speed of sound. This is called the transonic zone. When a bullet breaks the sound barrier in reverse, the shockwave catches up to the projectile, violently buffeting it. It tumbles. It loses stability. Trying to hit an 18-inch plate at 200 yards with a 7.62 meter is like trying to throw a paper airplane through a hurricane and hit a mail slot. General Mitchell had moved from the bleachers to stand directly behind my lane. His arms crossed over his chest. He knew the limitations of my weapon system. He was watching to see if I was a fool or a prodigy. I dropped my mat onto the scorching asphalt. I lay down behind the rifle, pushing my weight forward into the bipod to load it, creating a rock-solid platform. Sergeant Miller lay down to my right, setting up his Leupold Mark IV spotting scope. We had no weather meters. We had no ballistic computers. We had a spiral-bound notebook, a pencil, and thousands of hours of instinct. Talk to me, Miller, I whispered, keeping my eye behind the scope. It's ugly out there, Patterson, Miller replied, his voice a low, steady rumble. Mirage is boiling left to right. We've got a dead spot at 600 yards. At 1,000 yards, the wind is ripping right to left at about 8 miles per hour. It's a total blender. I did the math in my head. The numbers cascaded behind my eyes, falling into place like pieces of a puzzle. Target distance, 200 yards. Bullet drop, 5 on 20 inches. I reached up and dialed my elevation turret to its absolute maximum limit. I was out of clicks. I couldn't dial the scope high enough to account for the massive bullet drop. I'm maxed on elevation, Sergeant, I said. I'm going to have to hold over the target using the reticle. Understood, Miller said. To hit the diamond, you're going to have to aim roughly 15 feet above it and about 8 feet to the right to fight the wind and the spin drift. I heard a harsh, mocking laugh from the VIP tent behind me. 15 feet of holdover, my father loudly guffawed to Jonathan Hayes. She's shooting artillery now. This is going to be a comedy show. I blocked him out. I blocked out the heat, the sweat stinging my eyes, and the pressure of the ticking clock. I narrowed my universe down to the crosshairs in my optic. Specialist Patterson. The announcer called out, "Your 60 seconds begins now." I exhaled. I found the natural respiratory pause. I aimed my crosshairs at empty space, high and right of the target. I was aiming at nothing but blue sky and rippling desert air. I applied 2.5 pounds of pressure to the trigger. The sear broke. Crack. Because the M110 was semi-automatic, I didn't have to break my position to cycle a bolt. The weapon kicked. The buffer spring cycled with a metallic chunk, and I was instantly back on target. Tracking, Miller whispered intensely. Wait for it. Wait for it. The flight time was excruciating. At this distance, the bullet was practically floating down from the sky. Ping! The sound was sharp, metallic, and undeniable. The crowd erupted into a shocked gasp. Governor Harrison leapt to his feet. General Mitchell didn't move a muscle, but a slow, predator's smile crept across his weathered face. Dead center impact, Miller barked. Wind is holding. Send it again. Sending, I replied. Crack. Another eternity of waiting. The recoil traveled through my collarbone, grounding me. Ping. Hit, Miller yelled. That's 2. You have 40 seconds. Wind is shifting. Patterson, it's backing off at the target. Hold right only 5 feet. Adjusting, I said, sliding the crosshairs smoothly to the left, trusting Miller's read with my life. Crack. I watched the trace of the bullet through the scope, a tiny, distorted ripple in the air, slicing downward toward the steel. Ping. Hit, Miller roared. That's 3. You just tied the record. Patterson, 30 seconds on the clock. The firing line behind me had descended into absolute pandemonium. The corporate sponsors were screaming. The soldiers in my squad were howling like wolves. I couldn't see my father, but I could feel the suffocating weight of his silence. His impossible wind, his $1 million rifle, his hired Navy SEAL spotter. All of it had just been equalized by a 24-year-old enlisted soldier with a notebook and a standard-issue rifle. But I didn't want to tie the record. Tying the record left room for excuses. Tying the record meant he could still tell his friends it was a fluke. I needed to break it. I needed to shatter it so completely that Richard Patterson would never be able to look me in the eye and call me a lowly grunt ever again. 20 seconds, Patterson, Miller called out. But the triumph in his voice suddenly vanished, replaced by a sharp edge of panic. Hold fire, dust devil! I kept my eye glued to the scope, ripping across the desert floor, right at the 900-yard mark. A massive, swirling vortex of sand and sagebrush was tearing into our lane. It was a localized microstorm, a freak weather anomaly born from the baking thermals. It completely obscured the target. I can't see the plate, Sergeant, I said, my heart slamming against my ribs. You gotta wait it out, Miller said. his eye pressed hard against his spotting scope. The wind inside that devil is gusting 20, maybe 30 miles an hour. It'll throw your bullet 50 feet off course. Just hold. 10 seconds! The announcer's voice boomed over the PA, laced with raw adrenaline. She needs one more to break the record. Behind me, I heard my father's voice, a desperate, almost manic crow of victory. That's it. She's done. The clock is going to run out. You can't shoot through that. He was right. Standard sniper doctrine dictates you do not shoot through a heavy, unpredictable obstruction like a dust devil. You wait for clear air, but I didn't have clear air. I had 7 seconds. I stared at the swirling column of dirt. It was moving right to left. The wind inside it was violently pushing against the trajectory my bullet would need to take. I didn't consult Miller. There was no time for math. There was only instinct. If the dust devil was pushing left at 30 miles an hour, I needed to throw my bullet directly into the teeth of the vortex, so far to the right that it felt like madness. 5 seconds. I moved my crosshairs 20 feet to the right of where the target should be, aiming directly into the thickest, ugliest part of the brown, swirling sand. I aimed so high the target was entirely out of my field of view. I was shooting completely blind. "Patterson, what are you doing?" Miller hissed. "You're off the reservation." "Trust me," I whispered. 3 seconds. I pulled the trigger. Crack. "Time!" the buzzer screamed across the range. I didn't move. And then, cutting through the heavy desert heat, came the sweetest, most musical sound I have ever heard in my entire life. Ping! The crowd exploded. It wasn't polite applause. It was a deafening, thunderous roar. Corporal Bradley and PFC Jenkins grabbed each other, screaming at the top of their lungs. General Mitchell slapped his thigh, letting out a booming laugh of pure, unfiltered joy. "Holy Mother of God," Sergeant Miller breathed, pulling his face away from the spotting scope and looking at me as if I had just walked on water. "Impact, dead center, 4 hits. You broke the record, Patterson. You shot blind through a damn tornado and broke the record." I flipped my selector switch to safe. I cleared the weapon, popping the magazine out and locking the bolt to the rear. I stood up, brushing the dirt off my uniform. I didn't smile. I didn't celebrate. I maintained the absolute, terrifying composure of a United States Army soldier. I turned around. The VIP tent was on its feet. Governor Harrison was clapping so hard his hands looked red, but my eyes were locked on only one person. Richard Patterson was standing frozen near the bleachers. The smug, patrician arrogance that had defined his face for my entire life had been completely wiped away. He looked pale. He looked small. His mouth was slightly open, staring at the empty air above my head as if trying to calculate how the universe had just broken its own rules. Wyatt Sullivan, the high-priced SEAL spotter, was slowly shaking his head in disbelief. He looked at my father, then looked at me, and gave me a slow, deeply respectful nod. Game recognizes game. My father's billionaire friends were staring at him, their expressions a mix of confusion and pity. Jonathan Hayes, the man who had mocked me just hours earlier, awkwardly cleared his throat. "Well, Richard," Jonathan said, clapping my dad weakly on the shoulder. "Looks like the kid knows a thing or two after all. Incredible shooting." My father blinked, snapping out of his stupor. The narcissism kicked back in, a desperate defense mechanism trying to salvage his shattered ego. He pasted on a stiff, plastic smile and began walking toward me, spreading his arms wide as if to embrace me. "There she is," my father announced loudly, making sure the governor and the general could hear him. "That's Patterson blood for you, I always told her. If she applied the focus I taught her, she couldn't achieve anything. Incredible display of the fundamentals I instilled in her. Wouldn't you say, General?" He reached out to put his arm around my shoulder for the cameras. I took one sharp step back. His hand grabbed nothing but empty air. General Mitchell stepped forward, placing himself subtly but firmly between me and my father. The general towered over him, his chest covered in ribbons earned in actual combat, not corporate boardrooms. "Mr. Patterson," General Mitchell said, his voice cold and hard as a glacier, "with all due respect, you didn't teach this soldier a damn thing. What Specialist Patterson just did defies standard ballistics. That wasn't taught in a country club. That was earned in the dirt." My father's fake smile faltered. His hand dropped to his side. "Now see here, General." "No, you see here," the general interrupted, his tone leaving absolutely no room for debate. "You just spent the last hour embarrassing yourself with a weapon that costs more than a car, missing targets a child could hit with a spotter holding your hand. Your daughter just used standard-issue infantry equipment to rewrite the record books, in conditions that would make a seasoned sniper weep. She is a credit to the United States Army. Do not attempt to steal her glory to pad your bruised ego." The silence that followed was radioactive. You could feel the power dynamic in the air completely invert. My father, the untouchable CEO, the king of Patterson Defense Solutions, had just been publicly dressed down by a 2-star general in front of the governor of Nevada and his biggest investors. He looked at me. For the first time in 24 years, he didn't look at me with disgust. He looked at me with fear. He finally realized that he couldn't buy what I had. He couldn't control me. I wasn't his failed daughter anymore. I was a predator, and I had just outclassed him on his own hunting grounds. "I brought what I needed. Dad," I said, my voice low, steady, and carrying perfectly in the quiet tension of the firing line. "Just like I told you." I slung my rifle over my shoulder, grabbed my Pelican case, and turned my back on him. "Let's go, squad," I said. "We're done here." Sergeant Miller, Corporal Bradley, and PFC Jenkins fell in behind me in perfect formation. As we walked away and the crowd parted for us, they didn't see lowly grunts anymore. They saw the undisputed masters of the range, and as the sun began to set over the Nevada desert, casting long, sharp shadows across the tarmac, I knew one thing for certain. I had enlisted to escape my father's shadow. But today, I made him live in mine. The ride back to the base in the Humvee was the quietest, most electrified silence I had ever experienced. For the first 20 miles, the only sound was the hum of the diesel engine and the rattling of our gear over the uneven Nevada highway. Then, PFC Jenkins snorted. It was a stifled, half-choked sound, like he was trying to hold his breath underwater. Corporal Bradley looked over at him from the passenger seat. "You good, Jenkins?" "I'm just..." Jenkins wheezed, his face turning red. "I'm just replaying the look on that billionaire's face when the general told him to shut his mouth. I swear to God, I thought the man's soul left his body. That was the spark." The tension in the cab shattered, and the Humvee erupted. Bradley was slapping the dashboard, howling with laughter, and Sergeant Miller, a man who usually smiled about as often as a gargoyle, let out a booming, chest-deep laugh that filled the heavy air. Even I couldn't stop the grin that finally broke across my face. "You didn't just beat him, Patterson," Miller said, wiping a tear of mirth from his eye. "You broke his entire reality. You took a standard-issue Knight's armament rifle and dragged a $10,000 custom rig through the mud in front of the governor." But the high of the victory was short-lived, replaced quickly by the inevitable machine of the modern age, the internet. In the VIP bleachers, dozens of people had been recording the event on their phones. Jonathan Hayes' own social media team had been live-streaming the competition to promote Patterson Defense Solutions. They hadn't cut the feed fast enough. By the time we pulled into our motor pool back at the battalion, my phone was vibrating so violently in my pocket I thought the battery was going to melt. The video of the Dust Devil shot had hit Reddit's tactical boards first. From there, it jumped to Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok. It wasn't just the shot that was going viral. It was the aftermath. Someone had a crystal-clear audio recording of General Mitchell utterly dismantling my father's ego. The internet, ever hungry for the humiliation of arrogant billionaires, devoured it. Headlines from military blogs and tactical websites began popping up on my feed. Enlisted Grunt embarrasses defense CEO with standard issue gear. The 1-200-yard miracle. Why money can't buy skill. 2-star general destroys billionaire on the firing line. The next morning, I was called into Captain Reynolds' office. He was sitting behind his desk, a tablet in his hand, a steaming cup of black coffee resting on a stack of reports. "Close the door, specialist," he said, not looking up. I closed the door and stood at parade rest. "Sir." Reynolds turned the tablet around and slid it across the desk. It was an article from the Wall Street Journal financial section. The headline read, "Patterson Defense Solutions, stock dips 4% following disastrous PR stunt at military invitational." "You made quite a splash yesterday." "Patterson," Reynolds said, his voice neutral. "General Mitchell called the battalion commander personally last night. He wanted to ensure that you were recognized for your marksmanship. He also wanted to ensure that no corporate entity attempts to retaliate against you or this unit." "Retaliate, sir?" "Your father," Reynolds said, finally looking me in the eye. "Richard Patterson made 3 calls to the Pentagon this morning. He is furious. He claimed the range conditions were manipulated. He claimed your M110 was unauthorized and heavily modified with illegal, non-standard parts. He is demanding a formal inquiry into the competition." I felt a cold surge of anger. "That's a lie, sir. My weapon is standard issue. The armorer can verify the serial numbers and the internal components. It hasn't been touched." "I know that, and the armorer already signed a sworn affidavit verifying it," Reynolds said smoothly, leaning back in his chair. "The Army knows it. But your father is trying to save a multi-million-dollar defense contract that General Mitchell is currently overseeing. Your little stunt made his flagship sniper platform look like an overpriced paperweight. He is cornered, Patterson, and cornered animals bite." Reynolds stood up, walking around his desk. "You are not in trouble, specialist. In fact, you did this uniform proud. But I need you to be on high alert. The people your father runs with do not accept defeat gracefully. Dismissed." I left the office with a heavy knot in my stomach. I knew my father better than anyone. He didn't just get mad, he got even. If he couldn't beat me on the range, he was going to try and rewrite the narrative. I just didn't expect him to send his favorite weapon to do it. 2 days later, I was in the motor pool, elbow deep in grease, replacing a worn trackpad on a Bradley fighting vehicle. The Nevada heat was brutal, the kind that bakes the concrete and makes the air smell like hot iron and diesel fuel. I was wearing my grease-stained coveralls, sweat dripping from my nose, a wrench gripped tight in my aching hands. "Patterson!" I slid out from under the armored hull on my creeper board, standing at the edge of the motor pool, looking like an alien species that had just crash-landed on a trash planet, was my sister, Abigail. She was wearing a tailored, bone-white Alexander McQueen suit and $1,000 Louboutin heels. She had parked a rented Mercedes G-Wagon directly in the commander's reserved spot. A couple of mechanics from the motor pool stopped what they were doing, staring at her in sheer bewilderment. I wiped my hands on a dirty rag, my jaw tightening. Abigail never went anywhere without a motive, and she certainly didn't visit military bases for her health. "Abby," I said, walking over to her. I didn't offer a hug. We hadn't hugged since we were children. "Alice," she said, her nose crinkling slightly at the smell of heavy machinery and sweat. She looked me up and down, her eyes full of the same condescending pity our father always wore. "Look at you. You look like a coal miner. Is this really how you want to spend your 20s? "What do you want, Abby? I'm on shift," she sighed, reaching into her designer handbag and pulling out a pair of oversized sunglasses. "Is there somewhere we can talk? Somewhere with air conditioning and fewer, grease monkeys?" "We talk here," I said, leaning against a concrete barricade. "Make it fast." Abigail's corporate smile tightened. She checked her surroundings, ensuring nobody was within earshot, before dropping the pleasantries. "Dad is losing his mind. Alice, do you have any idea what you've done?" She hissed, her polished veneer cracking just a fraction. "The stock is plummeting. The board of directors held an emergency meeting yesterday. General Mitchell is on the Armed Services Procurement Committee, and he is threatening to pull Patterson Defense's bid for the new XM-880 contract. That contract is worth $400 million. You are single-handedly destroying the family business. I didn't destroy anything, I replied coldly. Dad decided to bring a prototype rifle to a public event before it was ready. He missed. I hit. That's not my fault. That's physics. Oh, grow up, Abigail snapped. This isn't about physics or your little medals. This is about business. Dad was humiliated. He's the laughingstock of the defense sector right now, and all because you had to play the rebellious hero. He mocked me in front of hundreds of people. Abby, he tried to humiliate me. He just didn't expect me to shoot back. Abigail let out a long, exasperated breath. She reached back into her handbag and pulled out a thick, cream-colored envelope. She held it out to me. "What is this?" I asked, not taking it. "It's a cashier's check for $500,000, Abigail said, her voice dropping to a smooth, persuasive purr. Along with a standard non-disclosure agreement and a prepared press statement, I stared at the envelope, a sickening realization washing over me. "You're trying to bribe me." "It's not a bribe, Alice. It's a retroactive sponsorship fee," Abigail corrected seamlessly, speaking in pure corporate double talk. The press statement simply says that during the Ironclad Challenge, you were secretly field testing a proprietary Patterson Defense drop-in trigger assembly and utilizing our experimental match-grade ammunition. It says that your success on the range was a direct result of our technology. I actually laughed, a dry, bitter sound that echoed off the metal sides of the armored vehicles. "You want me to lie? You want me to tell the world that the only reason I broke the record was because Dad's company secretly carried me. It saves the narrative." "Alice," Abigail urged, stepping closer, her heels clicking on the concrete. "If we release this, it proves that Patterson technology is superior, even in standard-issue weapons. The stock recovers, the general backs off the contract cancellation, and Dad is willing to forgive you. He'll even bring you into the company. Vice President of Military Liaison. You can finally stop playing in the dirt and come home." I looked at my older sister. I looked at her perfect hair, her expensive suit, and the utter moral bankruptcy hiding behind her eyes. She genuinely didn't understand why I wouldn't just take the money. In her world, everything had a price tag. Truth, honor, reputation, it was all just currency to be traded. "Abby," I said softly, "do you know why Dad missed those shots?" She blinked, caught off guard by the question. "What? The wind?" "No, not the wind. The wind was bad, but he missed because the titanium receiver on his precious XM-880 rifle heats up too fast. It retains thermal energy. After his third shot, the heat mirage coming off his own barrel blinded his optic, and the metal expansion warped the harmonics of his barrel by a fraction of a millimeter. His rifle is a fragile, over-engineered piece of garbage that can't survive in a real-world environment." Abigail's face paled. "If he sells that weapon to the military," I continued, my voice hardening to steel, "soldiers are going to die, because when they are in a desert in the Middle East, and they need that gun to fire true on the 5th or 6th shot, it's going to fail them, just like it failed Dad." "Alice, you don't know what you're talking about." "I am not signing your paper," I said, stepping away from the barricade. "I am not taking your money, and if you or Dad ever try to put words in my mouth again, I will go on national television and break down exactly why the XM-880 is a death trap. Now get your rental car out of my commander's parking spot before I have the MPs tow it." Abigail stared at me, her eyes flashing with a sudden, vicious fury. The mask was completely gone. "You think you're so righteous," she spat, her voice trembling with rage. "You think you've won. Dad isn't going to let a lowly enlisted grunt ruin his empire. General Mitchell called a closed-door procurement hearing in Washington next week to finalize the contract termination. Dad is going to testify, and he is going to destroy your credibility. Alice. He has lawyers and engineers who will swear on a Bible that you cheated. You should have taken the money. She turned on her heel, marching back to the G-Wagon. She slammed the door, the engine roaring to life, and sped out of the motor pool. I stood there for a long time, the stench of exhaust fumes mingling with the desert air. My family had just declared war on me, but they had forgotten one crucial detail. I was infantry. I was built for war. Washington, D.C. feels like a different planet compared to a tactical firing range in Nevada. There is no dust. There is no wind. There is only marble, mahogany, and the quiet, suffocating pressure of absolute power. General Mitchell had flown me and Sergeant Miller to D.C. on a military transport plane. I was wearing my Army service uniform, crisp greens, mirror-polished jump boots, the gold U.S. insignias gleaming on my lapels. The ribbons on my chest weren't bought. They were earned. We were standing in the antechamber of Committee Room 4B inside the Pentagon. Behind the heavy oak doors, the Armed Services Committee for Weapons Procurement was holding a closed-door session. My father was inside, fighting for his $400 million lifeline. "You ready for this, Patterson?" Sergeant Miller asked quietly, adjusting the cuffs of his own dress uniform. "I've spent my whole life dealing with his lies, Sergeant," I replied, keeping my eyes fixed on the oak doors. Today, I put an end to it. The doors opened. A young Marine guard nodded to us. "General Mitchell is ready for you. Specialist." I marched into the room, Sergeant Miller a step behind me. The room was intimidating. A long, curved mahogany table dominated the space, seating 5 high-ranking military officials and 2 civilian defense contractors. General Mitchell sat in the center. And there, sitting at the witness table in a bespoke charcoal suit, was my father. Next to him sat his lead engineer and a very expensive-looking corporate lawyer. When my father saw me walk in, his smug expression faltered for a microsecond before hardening into a glare of absolute hatred. I came to attention in the center of the room and rendered a crisp salute to the board. Specialist Alice Patterson, reporting as ordered. "Sir." "At ease, Specialist," General Mitchell said, returning the salute. He looked down at a thick file in front of him. "Mr. Patterson here has just spent the last 45 minutes giving this committee a very colorful version of the events that transpired at the Ironclad Challenge." General Mitchell turned his steely gaze toward my father. "Mr. Patterson claims that the catastrophic failure of his XM-880 sniper platform was an anomaly caused by corrupted ammunition. Furthermore, he has submitted a sworn statement from his engineering team claiming that your record-breaking performance was medically and scientifically impossible with standard-issue gear. He is formally accusing you of utilizing unauthorized, unapproved modifications to a United States military weapon to defame his company." The lawyer next to my father leaned into his microphone. "General, with respect, the telemetry data proves it. A standard 7.62 round cannot maintain that trajectory in a crosswind through a visual obstruction. Specialist Patterson had to be using our proprietary gyroscopic smart optics and our heavy-grain match ammo. She is disgruntled family, attempting to sabotage a vital defense contract out of petty spite." I didn't look at the lawyer. I looked right at my father. He wouldn't meet my eyes. He was staring at the table, his jaw clenched tight. "Specialist Patterson," General Mitchell said, steepling his fingers. "How do you respond to these allegations?" "Permission to approach the committee, sir." "Granted." I walked forward and placed a small, battered green spiral notebook on the mahogany table. It was stained with sweat and dirt. I then placed a manila folder next to it. "General, members of the committee," I said, my voice steady, echoing clearly in the quiet room. "This is my dope book, Data on Previous Engagements. It contains the handwritten ballistic math, wind calls, and environmental data for every single shot I took that day. Recorded in real time by my spotter, Staff Sergeant Miller. Furthermore, the folder contains the armory logs, signed under penalty of perjury by our battalion armorer, confirming the seal on my M110 was intact before and after the competition. It fires standard M118LR 175 grain ammunition. Nothing more. One of the civilian contractors on the board leaned forward, frowning. Then how did you make the shot? Specialist. It defies the weapon's operational limits. I didn't beat the physics, sir. I just understood them better than the man holding the prototype, I said, turning slightly to face my father's table. Mr. Patterson's XM880 failed because of thermal drift. The titanium alloy he used in the upper receiver looks great on a brochure, but it retains catastrophic levels of heat. After 3 rapid shots in a 105-degree desert, the metal expands, the barrel harmonics destabilize, the weapon literally warps itself out of zero. You could put a heat-seeking missile in that gun, and it would still miss a barn at 1,000 yards. My father slammed his hand on the table, abandoning all pretense of corporate composure. That is a lie. You are a 24-year-old enlisted nobody. You don't know the first thing about metallurgical engineering. I don't need to know how to forge the metal. Dad, I shot back, my voice rising to meet his, the years of suppressed anger finally bleeding through. I just need to know how to pull the trigger, and I know that if this committee approves your contract, you are going to put a defective, fragile piece of garbage into the hands of American soldiers. When they are taking fire in a valley in Kunar province, your gun is going to overheat, and they are going to die. Not because they missed, but because you cared more about profit margins than their lives. The room fell dead silent. The gravity of my words hung in the air like a physical weight. My father's lawyer frantically whispered in his ear, trying to get him to sit down, but my father was completely unglued. The narcissistic rage had taken over. "You ungrateful little wretch," he snarled, pointing a shaking finger at me. "I gave you everything. I offered you the world, and you chose to roll in the mud with the peasants. You are a disgrace to the Patterson name." General Mitchell slammed his wooden gavel down so hard it sounded like a gunshot. "That is enough," the general roared, his voice vibrating with command authority. My father froze, the color draining from his face as he realized where he was and who he was screaming at. "Mr. Patterson," General Mitchell said, his voice dropping to a dangerous, icy whisper. "You do not berate a soldier of the United States Army in my Pentagon. You do not lie to my procurement board. And you certainly do not try to sell me a weapon that compromises the lives of my men and women." The general picked up the heavy file detailing the XM880 contract and tossed it dismissively to the side of his desk. Based on the testimony of Specialist Patterson, the evidence provided in her logs, and the catastrophic field failure witnessed by myself and Governor Harrison, General Mitchell announced, looking my father dead in the eye. "The bid for the XM880 is officially terminated. Patterson Defense Solutions is hereby removed from the list of approved Department of Defense contractors, pending a full federal audit of your engineering practices." My father collapsed into his chair as if he had been shot. The $400 million contract wasn't just gone. His company had just been blacklisted by the Pentagon. It was a corporate death sentence. "This committee is adjourned," the general said. As the board members stood up and began filing out of the room, my father sat paralyzed, staring at the mahogany table. His empire had just burned to ash, not by a corporate rival, but by the daughter he had deemed too lowly to respect. I turned around, adjusting my beret on my head. I didn't say a word to him. I didn't need to. The silence was the loudest victory I could ever claim. I walked out of the heavy oak doors, back into the marble halls of the Pentagon, leaving Richard Patterson alone in the dark. The destruction of an empire doesn't happen with a massive explosion. It happens with 1,000 tiny, bureaucratic cuts. In the weeks following the Pentagon hearing, Patterson Defense Solutions bled to death in the public eye. The Department of Defense didn't just cancel the XM880 contract. They initiated a full-scale audit of my father's entire manufacturing pipeline. When the federal investigators started kicking down doors, the rats fled the sinking ship. Jonathan Hayes, my father's biggest financial backer, publicly divested all his shares and issued a press release condemning the company's lack of engineering integrity. The stock, which had been trading at $85 a share the morning of the Nevada Invitational, plummeted to $4.12. My father's picture was plastered across financial news networks, not as a titan of industry, but as a cautionary tale of corporate hubris. I returned to my unit, trying to blend back into the rhythm of standard deployments and training rotations. I didn't want to be a celebrity. I just wanted to be a soldier. A month later, I was promoted to sergeant, earning my stripes because of my proficiency, not my last name. But a man like Richard Patterson doesn't just accept defeat. If he couldn't beat me on the range or in the courtroom, he would try to destroy me in the shadows. It started on a Tuesday evening. I lived in a modest, off-base apartment complex. It was small, cheap, and smelled faintly of old carpet and bleach, but it was mine. I had just finished a 6-mile run and was unlocking my front door when my cell phone buzzed. The number was unlisted. "Hello?" I answered, wiping sweat from my forehead. "Sergeant Patterson." A deep, gravelly voice said, "Don't go inside your apartment." I froze, my hand still on the doorknob. My military instincts kicked in instantly. My eyes scanned the dimly lit hallway, looking for threats. "Who is this?" "This is Wyatt Sullivan. I was the spotter for your father in Nevada." I gripped the phone tighter. "I remember you. What do you want, Mr. Sullivan?" "I'm calling to balance the scales," Wyatt said softly. "I took your father's money to read his wind, and I'll live with that. But I draw the line at framing an active-duty service member. Your sister, Abigail, reached out to a private fixer in D.C. yesterday. A guy named Gregory Finch. He specializes in corporate sabotage and ruining reputations." A cold chill ran down my spine. "What did they do?" "Finch paid off your apartment manager an hour ago to let him into your unit," Wyatt explained, his voice flat and professional. "He planted 3 ounces of illicit narcotics in a burner phone with a fabricated text history detailing the sale of stolen military equipment in your bathroom vent. Abigail is planning to place an anonymous tip to the military police tonight. They want you dishonorably discharged. If you open that door, you break the seal, and they've got you." I felt the blood drain from my face. They weren't just trying to hurt my pride anymore. They were trying to send me to federal prison. "Why are you telling me this, Sullivan?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Because I was a Navy SEAL for 12 years before I sold out to the private sector," Wyatt replied. "I watched you shoot through a dust devil at a 200 yards to protect your brothers in arms from a defective weapon. You're the real deal, kid. Your father is a snake. Get ahead of this. I've sent Finch's license plate and description to your phone. Good luck." The line went dead. I didn't open my door. I backed away slowly, pulling out my phone and dialing the one man I trusted with my life. "Miller," I said when he picked up. "I need you here. Now. Bring Bradley. And bring zip ties." 20 minutes later, Staff Sergeant Miller and Corporal Bradley rolled into the parking lot of my complex in Miller's beat-up Ford F-150. I quickly briefed them on Sullivan's call. Miller's face turned into a mask of pure, murderous rage. Nobody messes with one of his own. Instead of going into my apartment, we found the apartment manager, a sweaty, nervous guy named Phil, and cornered him in his office. It only took about 30 seconds of Miller glaring at him before Phil cracked, admitting he took $2,000 in cash to let a man in a gray suit into my place. We didn't call the MPs. Not yet. We waited in the shadows near the back exit of the complex. Sure enough, an hour later, a sleek black sedan pulled up. A man in a sharp gray suit stepped out, Gregory Finch. He was probably coming back to ensure the trap was set perfectly before Abigail made the call. Before Finch could even lock his car door, Miller was on him. It wasn't a fight. It was an overwhelming display of kinetic force. Miller shoved Finch hard against the side of the sedan, while Bradley expertly swept his legs out from under him. Finch hit the asphalt with a heavy thud, gasping for air, before he could scream. Miller had him flipped on his stomach, his hands zip-tied behind his back. I walked out of the shadows and crouched down next to Finch's face. He looked terrified, staring up at 3 highly trained infantrymen who looked like they were ready to bury him in the desert. "Gregory Finch, I presume," I said coldly. "You're assaulting a private citizen." Finch gasped, struggling against the plastic ties. "You broke into the residence of a United States Army non-commissioned officer to plant narcotics," I replied, pulling his wallet out of his jacket and looking at his ID. "That makes you a domestic threat. Now, you're going to call my sister. Put it on speaker." I held his phone up to his face. Trembling, he unlocked it. I found Abigail's contact and hit dial. She picked up on the second ring. "Finch, is it done? Did you make the call to the military police?" "Hello, Abby," I said into the phone. Dead silence on the other end. "Alice?" Abigail finally whispered, her voice laced with sudden panic. "Where is Finch?" "Finch is currently face down on the pavement, reconsidering his career choices," I said smoothly. "I know about the drugs in the vent. I know about the burner phone. Here is what is going to happen. Abigail, I am calling the local police. I am handing Mr. Finch, along with the apartment manager you bribed, over to the authorities. They will trace the money back to you." "Alice, wait, please." "Shut up and listen," I snapped, the venom in my voice making Finch flinch. "You and Dad have officially crossed the line from pathetic to criminal. If you ever come near my unit, my home, or my career again, I will not handle it in a boardroom. I will handle it the way the Army taught me. Do not test me again. Consider this your final warning." I hung up the phone and dropped it on Finch's back. "Bradley," I said, standing up, "call the cops. Tell them we caught a burglar. The frame-up fell apart spectacularly." Finch, trying to save his own skin, flipped on Abigail. The ensuing police investigation resulted in Abigail being indicted for conspiracy and evidence tampering. The board of directors at Patterson Defense finally had enough. They ousted my father as CEO, stripping him of his controlling shares to save what little remained of the company. Richard Patterson was utterly ruined. But a desperate man with inventory is a dangerous thing. 6 months passed. The noise surrounding my family faded into the background, replaced by the demanding cadence of military life. Our battalion was slated for an overseas deployment. It wasn't a frontline combat tour, but a joint security and training mission in a highly volatile region of North Africa. Our objective was to secure a massive Allied logistics hub and train local proxy forces. It was a blistering, miserable environment. The base, Camp Liberty, was essentially a massive concrete fortress dropped into the middle of an ocean of unforgiving sand. The heat easily reached 115 degrees by noon. The air was thick with a fine, powdery dust that got into your eyes, your lungs, and every moving part of your weapon. We had been on the ground for 3 weeks when the private military contractors arrived. The U.S. government often outsources perimeter security for logistics hubs to private military companies, PMCs, to free up active duty troops for other missions. The PMC contracted for Camp Liberty was called Aegis Tactical Group. They were a well-funded, highly aggressive outfit run by a former British SAS operator named Liam Caulfield. I was walking across the motor pool with Sergeant Miller when the convoy of black, up-armored SUVs rolled through the main gate. The Aegis mercenaries poured out. They looked like action figures, wearing unapproved combat shirts, sporting thick beards, and covered in expensive, non-standard tactical gear. But it wasn't their beards or their sunglasses that caught my eye. It was what they were carrying. Every single one of their designated marksmen stepped out of the vehicles holding a sleek, heavily fluted sniper rifle with a distinct titanium upper receiver. The XM880. I stopped dead in my tracks, my blood running cold. "Miller," I said, pointing toward the contractors. Look at their weapons. Miller squinted through the glaring sun. When he recognized the distinct profile of the Patterson defense rifle, he let out a low, colorful string of curses. You have got to be kidding me. How did they get those? The Pentagon blacklisted them. The Pentagon did, I replied, my stomach twisting into a knot. Aegis is a private corporation. They can buy their gear from whoever they want. It all made sickening sense. My father, ousted from his company, facing millions in debt and holding a warehouse full of defective, unsellable prototype weapons, had found a loophole. He had liquidated his inventory at a massive discount to a private military company. He had dumped his garbage on mercenaries. I marched straight across the tarmac, ignoring the warning looks from the mercs, until I found their commander. Liam Caulfield was a tall, heavily tattooed man with a fading scar across his jawline. He was leaning against the hood of an SUV, barking orders into a radio. "Excuse me, Mr. Caulfield?" I said, standing firm. Caulfield turned, looking down at my rank insignia. "Sergeant, what can Aegis do for the regular army today?" "I'm Sergeant Alice Patterson," I said. I watched his eyes flicker with brief recognition. He knew the name. Everyone in the tactical community had seen the viral video of the Nevada incident. "Ah, the Patterson girl," Caulfield smirked, crossing his massive arms. "The 100-yard miracle. Your old man gave us a hell of a deal on these XM880s. Said the Pentagon canceled the contract over political red tape. Said you had a personal vendetta." "It wasn't politics, Caulfield," I said, fighting to keep my voice level. "It was physics. That weapon is a death trap. The titanium receiver suffers from catastrophic thermal drift. If your men get into a prolonged firefight in this environment, those barrels are going to warp. The guns will fail." Caulfield laughed, a harsh, dismissive sound. "Listen, sweetheart, I appreciate the concern, but Aegis doesn't use standard issue junk. We rigorously tested these rifles on an air-conditioned indoor range in London before we shipped out. They drive tacks. Maybe your dad just didn't know how to shoot it. An air-conditioned range is not the North African desert," I snapped, gesturing to the baking sand dunes beyond the wire. "The ambient temperature here is 110 degrees. If your marksmen dump a 20-round magazine, that titanium is going to cook. They will lose their zero instantly." Caulfield's smile vanished. He stepped closer, trying to use his size to intimidate me. "I don't take tactical advice from a 24-year-old army grunt who got lucky with a tailwind. Go back to the barracks, Sergeant. Let the professionals handle the perimeter." Miller stepped up right behind my shoulder, his hand resting casually on his tactical belt. "You want to rethink your tone. Contractor?" Caulfield glanced at Miller, then back to me, sneering. "We're running the Northern Patrol route tomorrow. Sergeant, I guess we'll see how the weapons hold up. Stay out of our way." He turned and walked away. "He's not going to listen, Alice," Miller said quietly. "I know," I replied, staring at the shiny, defective rifles slung across the mercenaries' backs. "But the desert doesn't care about his ego, and when those guns fail, they are going to drag us into the fire with them." The Northern Patrol route was known locally as the Anvil. It was a 30-mile stretch of crumbling highway, flanked by steep, rocky ridges on both sides. It was an absolute nightmare from a tactical perspective, a natural choke point that provided high ground and perfect cover for anyone wanting to stage an ambush. Because Aegis was officially handling the security detail, my squad was relegated to the QRF, Quick Reaction Force. We sat inside the wire at Camp Liberty in our armored striker vehicles, fully geared up, engines idling, sweating through our combat shirts while we monitored the radio traffic. By 1300 hours, the temperature had climbed to 118 degrees. The inside of the striker felt like a slow cooker. I was sitting next to Corporal Bradley, holding my scratched, reliable M110 sniper rifle across my lap. It had no titanium. It had no smart optics. It was just forged steel and matte black aluminum. The radio in the striker crackled to life. At first, it was just routine chatter from the Aegis convoy. Aegis actual to base. We are passing checkpoint Delta, entering the Anvil Gorge. Visual is clear. 10 minutes passed in suffocating heat, and then the radio exploded. Contact! Contact! We are taking heavy PKM machine gun fire from the eastern ridge. Multiple RPGs. Convoy is halted. Vehicle 2 is disabled. We have men pinned down. The voice on the radio was panicked, stripped of all the arrogant mercenary bravado. Captain Reynolds' voice came over the battalion net instantly. QRF, this is command. Aegis Patrol is ambushed at grid 44-9er. Spin up and deploy. Dust off in 2 mics. Let's go, let's go, let's go, Miller yelled, slapping the roof of the striker. The driver slammed the vehicle into gear, and we launched out of the gates, a massive cloud of dust billowing behind us. It took us 12 agonizing minutes to reach the coordinates. The scene inside the gorge was chaotic. 3 black Aegis SUVs were parked in a staggered defensive formation, riddled with bullet holes. One was burning, sending thick plumes of toxic black smoke into the sky. The mercenaries were pinned behind the engine blocks, returning fire against an unseen enemy situated high up on the rocky cliffs. The insurgents had the high ground and were pouring heavy suppression fire down into the valley. We rolled up behind the Aegis vehicles, the striker's heavy armor absorbing the incoming small arms fire with loud, metallic clangs. We dropped the ramp and spilled out into the blinding heat. Patterson, Bradley, get on that berm and find me targets, Miller roared over the deafening crackle of gunfire. I scrambled up a small, sandy embankment behind the burning SUV, throwing myself into the dirt. I deployed the bipod of my M110, pressed my eye to the scope, and scanned the ridgeline. 10 yards to my left, I saw one of the Aegis-designated marksmen. He was a big, burly guy named Davies. He was lying behind a rock, gripping the XM880 my father had sold him. I can't hit them, Davies was screaming into his radio, absolute panic in his eyes. My zero is completely gone. I watched him. Davies lined up his shot on an insurgent muzzle flash about 600 yards up the cliff. He fired. Through my own scope, I saw the bullet impact the rocks a full 5 feet to the right of the target. Davies cursed, frantically cycling the bolt. He fired again. This time, the bullet hit 10 feet low. It's the heat, I yelled over the gunfire, crawling toward him. The titanium receiver of the XM880 was smoking, literally smoking. The violent ambient heat of the desert, combined with the rapid firing schedule, had cooked the metal. The thermal expansion had warped the receiver just enough to completely throw the barrel out of alignment. The expensive, smart optic was useless because the gun itself was physically bending. My father's masterpiece was failing exactly how I knew it would. Suddenly, an insurgent RPG tore down from the cliff, slamming into the dirt just 20 feet from our position. The shockwave lifted me off the ground, raining dirt and shrapnel over our heads. They're flanking us on the left ridge, Caulfield screamed, taking cover near the front SUV. He looked terrified. His multi-million-dollar squad was being systematically dismantled because their long-range assets couldn't hit the broadside of a mountain. Miller, I shouted into my comms. Insurgent sniper team moving into position on the left overhang. Distance is 800 yards. High angle. Clear them out! Patterson! Miller barked back. I ignored the screaming mercenaries. I ignored the burning SUV. I pulled my M110 tight into my shoulder. The heavy steel of my rifle was hot to the touch, but it wasn't warping. It was built for this. I found the insurgent team in my crosshairs. They were setting up a heavy DSHK machine gun that would tear our striker to shreds. Bradley, give me a wind read, I yelled. Updraft from the fire, Bradley yelled back, glued to his spotting scope. Wind is pushing hard, right to left, maybe 10 miles an hour at the ridge. Hold 2 miles right, elevate 6.5. I dialed my elevations smoothly. I didn't have a Kestrel weather meter. I didn't have a ballistic computer. I just had my dope book, my training, and a gun that wouldn't quit. I found my hold. I exhaled. Crack. The 7.62 round flew true, slicing through the superheated desert air. Through the scope, I saw the insurgent gunner slump violently backward, away from the weapon. "Target down," Bradley yelled. "His buddy is trying to man the gun. Shift left." I didn't pause. I let the recoil settle the weapon back onto the target. The M110 didn't jam. It didn't warp. It cycled perfectly. Crack. The second insurgent fell before he could even touch the grips of the machine gun. "Two down," Bradley called out. I didn't stop. I systematically moved across the ridgeline, identifying muzzle flashes and putting rounds exactly where they needed to be. The heavy steel barrel of my rifle grew scorching hot, but the zero held true. Every time I pulled the trigger, an enemy element was neutralized. Beside me, the Aegis marksman, Davies, had completely given up. He had thrown his $15,000 XM880 into the dirt in sheer frustration and drawn his sidearm, staring at me in absolute awe as I surgically dismantled the ambush with a standard-issue weapon. Within 10 minutes, the volume of incoming fire dropped from a deafening roar to a sporadic trickle. The insurgents, realizing their high ground advantage had been completely neutralized by a single American sniper, began to retreat over the backside of the ridge. "Cease fire! Cease fire!" Miller yelled, his voice echoing off the canyon walls. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the crackling of the burning SUV and the groans of the wounded. I flipped my weapon to safe, stood up slowly, and brushed the North African dirt off my knees. I looked down at the XM880 lying discarded in the sand. Its titanium barrel was visibly discolored from the heat, a useless, hollow monument to Richard Patterson's ego. Liam Caulfield, covered in dust and bleeding from a small shrapnel cut on his cheek, walked over to my position. He looked at the discarded sniper rifle on the ground, and then he looked at me. The arrogant swagger was entirely gone. He knew how close he had just come to losing his entire team. "You warned me," Caulfield said, his voice raspy from the smoke. "I told you," I replied, my voice hard and unforgiving. The desert doesn't care about the price tag, and it doesn't care about egos. I walked past him, heading back toward my squad. My father had tried to buy the military. He had tried to buy his reputation. And when that failed, he had sold out his own integrity, putting these men in the crosshairs just to make a buck. But out here, in the dirt, money couldn't pull the trigger. "Mount up! QRF!" Miller commanded, clapping me hard on the shoulder as I passed. "Good shooting, Patterson." "Just doing my job, Sergeant," I said, climbing into the back of the striker. My father was a CEO, but I was a soldier. And today, I finally proved which title carried real weight. The aftermath of the Anvil Gorge ambush didn't just stay in the desert. It echoed all the way back to the marble corridors of Washington, D.C., carried on the furious, heavily accented voice of Liam Caulfield. When we finally returned to Camp Liberty, the Aegis contractors didn't go to the mess hall. They didn't go to the medical tent to patch their minor scrapes. Caulfield ordered his men to gather every single XM880 rifle from their armory. 24 weapons in total. He loaded them into the back of a tactical flatbed, drove straight to the United States Command Operations Center, and dumped them onto the concrete floor in front of the base commander. I was standing near the perimeter wire, cleaning the dust out of my M110, when I watched the spectacle unfold. Caulfield was completely unhinged, pointing at the warped, discolored titanium receivers and screaming about how Richard Patterson had knowingly sold his men overpriced scrap metal that nearly got his entire detail slaughtered. Because Aegis was officially contracted by the Department of Defense, the failure of their equipment during a joint operation triggered an immediate, mandatory investigation by the Inspector General. The military seized the rifles as evidence. They ran metallurgical stress tests on the weapons right there on the base. The results were catastrophic. The titanium alloy didn't just warp in the 118-degree heat. The internal firing pins had actually begun to fuse to the bolt carriers due to the extreme friction and thermal expansion. 2 days later, I was called into Captain Reynolds' office. "Pack your bags. Sergeant Patterson," Reynolds said, handing me a set of travel orders. "You're going back to D.C. The Department of Justice has officially opened a criminal grand jury investigation into Patterson Defense Solutions for fraud, reckless endangerment, and violation of federal defense contracting statutes. They subpoenaed Caulfield, and they subpoenaed you." "A criminal investigation, sir?" I asked, looking at the paperwork. "Not just a Pentagon audit?" "Your father crossed the line from gross negligence to federal crimes," Reynolds explained, his face grave. He knew those weapons were defective after the Nevada incident. The Pentagon formally notified his company of the structural failures by liquidating that inventory to a DoD-contracted PMC without disclosing the thermal drift issues. He knowingly endangered American strategic interests and allied lives. He is facing decades in federal prison. My flight out of North Africa was long and quiet. I stared out the window of the C-17 transport plane at the endless black ocean below, feeling a strange, hollow sensation in my chest. For years, I had hated my father. I had wanted to prove him wrong. I had wanted to beat him. But I never wanted to see him locked in a cage. Yet, he had built that cage himself, bar by titanium bar. When I landed at Andrews Air Force Base, my cell phone reconnected to the cellular network. It instantly vibrated with 16 missed calls, all of them from my sister, Abigail. I sat on my duffel bag in the terminal and finally hit dial. She answered on the first ring. "Alice." Abigail gasped. Her voice wasn't polished. It wasn't dripping with that corporate, Wharton-educated condescension. She sounded terrified, exhausted, and incredibly small. "What is it, Abby?" "The FBI," she stammered, her breath hitching. "They raided the house this morning. Alice, they raided the corporate headquarters in Connecticut. They took everything. Hard drives, servers, paper files. They froze the company's operating accounts. They froze Dad's personal assets. I can't even pay my mortgage." I closed my eyes, rubbing the bridge of my nose. "You tried to frame an active duty soldier with narcotics. Abby. Dad sold defective weapons to mercenaries operating in a combat zone. Did you really think the government was just going to send a strongly worded letter? You have to help us," she pleaded, crying now. "You're the hero. Alice, the media loves you. General Mitchell listens to you. If you just talk to the federal prosecutor, if you tell them that the environment in Africa was an anomaly, that Dad didn't know." "He knew," I interrupted, my voice turning to stone. I stood in the Pentagon and told him exactly how and why that rifle would fail in the heat, and he still boxed them up and shipped them to the desert. He almost got my squad killed. Again. "He's your father," Abigail screamed, desperation clawing at her throat. "He's an old man. Alice, he won't survive federal prison. Please." He should have thought about that before he decided his bank account was worth more than human lives. I said quietly, "Don't call this number again. Abby, talk to your lawyer." I hung up, blocked her number, and picked up my duffel bag. The Patterson dynasty was collapsing, and I wasn't going to lift a single finger to catch the falling debris. The federal courthouse in Alexandria, Virginia, is a massive, sterile building of glass and steel. It lacks the historical majesty of the Capitol, but it makes up for it with an aura of absolute, crushing authority. I was escorted into a private deposition room on the 4th floor. I was wearing my Class A dress uniform, the green fabric perfectly pressed, my combat action badge and marksman medals catching the harsh fluorescent light. Seated at the long conference table was Assistant United States Attorney Marcus Vance, a sharp, unsmiling man who looked like he hadn't slept in a week. Next to him sat General Mitchell, representing the Pentagon's interests. And directly across the table sat Richard Patterson. When I walked in, I barely recognized him. The man who had mocked me at the Nevada firing range, the billionaire who had swaggered around in custom tactical gear, was completely gone. He looked like he had aged 20 years and 6 months. His expensive, bespoke suit hung loosely on his frame. His face was gaunt, and the arrogant fire in his eyes had been replaced by the dull, panicked stare of a cornered animal. His high-priced corporate lawyer sat beside him, looking equally miserable. "Sergeant Patterson," the federal prosecutor said, gesturing to an empty chair opposite my father. "Thank you for coming. We are recording this deposition for the grand jury record." I sat down, keeping my posture rigid. I didn't look at my father. I looked at the prosecutor. "Let's get right to it," Vance began, opening a thick binder. "Mr. Patterson, you are facing 22 counts of federal wire fraud, conspiracy to defraud the United States, and violations of the Arms Export Control Act. We have the emails. We have the financial transfers from Aegis Tactical Group to a shell company you set up in the Cayman Islands. But most damning of all, we have the physical weapons." Vance reached under the table and he heaved a heavy object onto the polished wood. It landed with a dull, heavy thud. It was the XM-880 rifle that the Aegis marksman had thrown into the sand. The titanium receiver was black with soot, deeply discolored by the extreme heat, and visibly bowed in the center. My father flinched as if the weapon were a live snake. "Your own lead engineer testified yesterday, Richard." Vance continued relentlessly. "He stated under oath that he warned you the titanium alloy was unstable above 95 degrees Fahrenheit. He told you it would warp. And yet, you authorized the sale of 80 units to a PMC deploying to North Africa. What is your defense?" My father's lawyer leaned into the microphone. "My client was under the assumption that Aegis was purchasing the weapons for domestic training purposes in a controlled climate. Objection. That is a blatant lie." Liam Caulfield's voice boomed from the corner of the room. I hadn't even noticed the mercenary sitting in the shadows. He stood up, walking toward the table. "I told Mr. Patterson personally that my men were spinning up for Camp Liberty. He told me the XM-880 was desert certified and battle ready. He sold me a bill of goods." My father finally cracked. His hand started shaking. He looked at Caulfield, then at the prosecutor, and finally, his desperate eyes locked onto me. The narcissist's last resort, emotional manipulation. "Alice," he whispered, his voice trembling. "Alice, please, tell them." I stared at him, my face an emotionless mask. "Tell them what, Dad?" "Tell them I didn't know," he pleaded, leaning across the table, completely ignoring his lawyer's frantic gestures to remain silent. "Tell them it was an oversight. You know how these manufacturing contracts work. There are so many moving parts. Abigail handled the logistics. She handled the shipping. Even in his darkest hour, he was trying to throw his golden child under the bus to save his own skin. It was sickening." "You want me to lie to a federal prosecutor to save you?" I asked, my voice chillingly calm. "I am your father," he barked, a flash of his old arrogance piercing through the panic. "I gave you life. I put a roof over your head. You owe me this. You ruined my company in Nevada. The least you can do is help me fix it." General Mitchell leaned forward, his eyes narrowing, but I held up a single hand, stopping him. "I didn't need the general to fight this battle. You didn't give me anything except a complex." "Richard," I said, dropping the title of Dad entirely. "You spent 24 years treating me like an embarrassment because I didn't want to wear a suit and steal money from the government like you. You mocked me in front of hundreds of people. You called me a lowly grunt. You told me I was cannon fodder." I reached out and placed my hand on the warped, blackened metal of the XM-880 on the table. "This is your legacy," I said softly, staring directly into his terrified eyes. "You built a weapon that looks beautiful in a boardroom, but falls apart the second it touches the dirt. That's who you are. You're a facade. And when that facade cracked, you tried to frame me for drug possession. You tried to send me to prison." His jaw dropped. He hadn't realized I knew he was behind Abigail's stunt with Gregory Finch. And when that failed, I continued, my voice rising with righteous, unyielding authority. You sold this defective trash to mercenaries, knowing it would fail. I watched a man almost die because his rifle melted in his hands. I had to shoot blindly through a dust storm in Nevada to prove you were a fraud, and I had to shoot through a valley in Africa to keep your fraud from getting my brothers killed. I stood up, pushing my chair back. I looked at the federal prosecutor. Mr. Vance, my official statement is this. Richard Patterson was fully briefed on the catastrophic thermal failure of the XM-880 platform by myself, in the presence of General Mitchell, 6 months prior to the Aegis sale. He acted with deliberate malice and reckless greed. Alice, please, my father sobbed, actually burying his face in his hands. It was the most pathetic display I had ever witnessed. I am a sergeant in the United States Army, I said, looking down at him. And I don't take orders from you anymore. Enjoy your cage. I turned on my heel and walked out of the deposition room. The heavy wooden door clicked shut behind me, severing the last tie I had to the Patterson name. I walked down the marble hallway, my jump boots clicking sharply against the floor, feeling lighter than I had in my entire life. The wheels of justice move slowly, but when they finally crush you, they grind you into dust. 6 months after the grand jury deposition, Richard Patterson accepted a plea deal to avoid a public trial that would have humiliated him further. He was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison for conspiracy and violating the Arms Export Control Act. He was 62 years old. It was effectively a life sentence. The government seized the 8,000 square foot estate in Connecticut, auctioning off his oil portraits, his luxury cars, and his country club memberships to pay restitution to the Department of Defense. Abigail didn't fare much better. She avoided jail time by turning state's evidence against our father, but she was given 5 years of federal probation and permanently banned from holding an executive position in any defense or government contracting corporation. She currently manages a mid-tier retail clothing store in a strip mall outside of Boston. We haven't spoken since that phone call at the airport. As for Patterson Defense Solutions, the company was dismantled. Its patents sold off to competitors at pennies on the dollar. The empire was wiped from the map. I didn't celebrate his downfall. There was no joy in watching my family implode, but there was a profound, quiet peace. The toxic cloud that had hovered over my life since childhood had finally dissipated. 2 years later, I stood on the dusty tarmac of a firing range at Fort Moore, Georgia. The heat was oppressive, the air thick with humidity and the smell of cordite. But this time, I wasn't the one lying in the dirt trying to prove myself. I was standing behind a spotting scope, wearing the stripes of a staff sergeant. Lying on the shooting mats in front of me were 12 young, nervous soldiers going through the Army's elite sniper school. They were sweating profusely, gripping their standard-issue M110s, waiting for my command. "Listen up," I barked, my voice carrying over the wind. "The weapon in your hands is only as good as the math in your head and the steady of your breathing. I don't care how much your scope costs. I don't care how fancy your gear is. If you can't read the wind, if you can't control your fear, you are just making noise." I walked down the line, adjusting a soldier's posture with a firm tap to his shoulder. "Sniper doctrine isn't about the gun," I continued, pacing behind them. "It's about the shooter. It's about taking the harshest, ugliest environments on Earth and finding perfect, absolute stillness inside of it. You are not machines. You are the masters of the machine. Do you understand?" "Yes, Staff Sergeant," the class yelled in unison. I looked down the range. The steel targets were set at 1,000 yards. The mirage was boiling off the asphalt, creating that familiar, dancing wave of heat. The wind flags were snapping erratically, pushing hard left to right. It was an ugly, tricky wind, the kind of wind that breaks egos. "Good," I said, a faint smile touching my lips. "Wind is full value from the left. Dial your elevation, hold your breath, fire at will, as the rhythmic, thundering cracks of the rifles echoed across the Georgia landscape. I looked out at the horizon. My father spent his entire life trying to buy power. He thought that wrapping himself in titanium and dollar bills made him untouchable. He looked down on the mud, the dirt, and the lowly enlisted soldiers who crawled through it. He never understood that the mud doesn't ruin you, it tempers you. I threw away a trust fund to become a soldier. I traded Italian leather for scuffed boots, and I traded boardrooms for trenches. And in the end, when the wind shifted and the pressure reached its breaking point, the billionaire broke, and the grunt held the line. Blood might be thicker than water, but it burns away in the fire of real combat. Integrity, however, integrity is forged in brass, measured in ballistics, and proven in the dirt. And nobody can ever take that away from me. You can bury a toxic legacy, but if you don't pour concrete over the grave, the ghost is bound to dig itself out. 2.5 years after my father, Richard Patterson, was locked behind the steel doors of a federal penitentiary, I thought the war was over. I was a staff sergeant, highly respected, running the advanced marksmanship courses at Fort Moore. I had traded the corporate nightmares of my family for the predictable, honorable rhythm of the United States Army. But the defense contracting world is a small, incestuous swamp, and the monsters that swim in it have very long memories. It started in late October. My sniper section was tapped for a high-profile NATO joint readiness exercise in Eastern Europe, Operation Sabre Strike. We were deploying to the Suwalki Gap in Poland, a dense, freezing, and strategically critical 65-mile stretch of forest that borders hostile territory. The objective was to integrate U.S. designated marksmen with Polish and Lithuanian special forces to run simulated border defense operations. It was a miserable environment. The Nevada desert bakes you, but the Polish autumn freezes you from the inside out. The rain was a constant, icy drizzle that turned the pine forests into a sprawling, inescapable ocean of gray mud. We had been on the ground at Camp Kosciuszko for 3 days when I saw him. I was walking out of the Tactical Operations Center, zipping up my wet weather gear, when a convoy of matte black, non-tactical vehicles rolled into the Allied staging area. The men who stepped out weren't NATO soldiers. They wore sterile tactical gear with no national flags, only a subdued patch on their shoulders, a gray wolf over a shattered sword. Apex Solutions. And leading them, looking slightly older but just as arrogant, was Liam Caulfield. I stopped dead in my tracks. Caulfield was the former British SAS mercenary who had run Aegis Tactical Group, the man who had bought my father's defective XM880 rifles and nearly gotten his entire squad slaughtered in North Africa. He saw me through the icy rain. A slow, venomous smile spread across his scarred face. He broke away from his men and walked directly toward me, his boots squelching in the mud. Well, if it isn't the Army's favorite whistleblower, Caulfield sneered, stopping just a few feet away. Staff Sergeant Patterson, you're looking a bit damp. Caulfield, I said, my voice as cold as the rain. I thought the Pentagon revoked your clearance after the disaster in Africa. They revoked Aegis's clearance, Caulfield corrected, his eyes flashing with a dark, resentful fire. So, I liquidated, rebranded, and bought a new board of directors. Apex Solutions is a completely different corporate entity. We just secured a logistical training contract with the Lithuanian Ministry of Defense. We're out here playing Op4 for your little NATO war games. We are the bad guys you're supposed to be hunting. I didn't like the look in his eye. It wasn't just corporate arrogance, it was deeply personal. I had humiliated him in front of his men, and my testimony had cost him millions. You should stay out of the woods. Caulfield. I warned him softly. You didn't do so well the last time we were in the field together. Caulfield leaned in, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. Your old man was a fool, Patterson. But before the FBI froze his assets, He had an offshore account in the Caymans. He transferred a substantial sum to me to quietly finish the R&D on the XM880. To fix the thermal drift. Turns out, the gun doesn't work in the African heat, but in the freezing cold of Eastern Europe, the titanium sings. My blood ran cold. My father, even from behind bars, had managed to fund this monster. We're running Sector 4 tomorrow, Caulfield continued, his smile turning completely feral. The live fire transition zone. Just you, your spotter, and the Polish woods. Watch your back, Staff Sergeant. Accidents happen in the mud all the time. Sometimes, people mistake a live round for a blank. It's a tragic, chaotic world. He turned and walked back to his mercenaries. I stood in the freezing rain, my heart pounding a heavy, primal rhythm against my ribs. This wasn't a training exercise anymore, and it was a hunt. Sector 4 of the Suwalki Gap is a nightmare of topography. It is a dense, ancient pine forest broken up by steep ravines and deep, freezing bogs. In a training exercise, the red zone is the designated area where units transition from firing blanks to live ammunition to engage steel pop-up targets, simulating a sudden, lethal escalation in combat. Sergeant Bradley, my longtime spotter, now wearing his own hard-earned stripes, was glued to my right side. We were low-crawling through a thick patch of wet ferns, covered head to toe in ghillie suits. The icy water seeped through our waterproof layers, chilling our bones. Comms are garbage, Alice, Bradley whispered, tapping his headset. I'm getting nothing but static from NATO command. The weather must be blocking the signal bounce. It's not the weather, I said grimly, scanning the dense tree line through my loopholed optic. Apex Solutions is running the AP4 for this sector. Caulfield is jamming us. He's deliberately isolating our grid. Bradley stopped crawling, his eyes widening beneath his camouflage face paint. You think they're going off script? Before I could answer, the forest exploded. Crack! It wasn't the muffled pop of a blank cartridge. It was the terrifying, supersonic whip of a live heavy-caliber round, breaking the sound barrier just inches above our heads. A massive chunk of pine bark exploded from the tree trunk directly between Bradley and me, showering us in razor-sharp wooden shrapnel. Live fire! Down! Down! I screamed, shoving Bradley's shoulder into the mud. Crack! Crack! 2 more rounds tore through the ferns, kicking up geysers of freezing mud. I instantly recognized the deep, concussive boom echoing through the valley. It was the .338 Lapua Magnum. Caulfield was using the modified XM880 Bravo, and he wasn't shooting at steel targets. He was shooting at us. I'm hit, Bradley gasped, clutching his left bicep. Blood, stark and crimson against the gray mud, began to seep through his uniform. The round hadn't hit him directly, but a massive splinter of wood from the tree had driven itself deep into his arm. Hold pressure on it, I ordered, my military training suppressing the spike of sheer terror in my chest. We were cut off. We had no radio. We were pinned down in a freezing ravine, and a squad of rogue mercenaries equipped with highly advanced, illegally funded sniper rifles were moving in for the kill. Caulfield planned to leave our bodies in the mud and claim it was a catastrophic friendly fire incident caused by poor visibility. I checked my weapon, because we were in the live fire sector. I had a full magazine of real M118LR 175 grain ammunition. 20 rounds of forged American steel. Bradley, give me your thermal poncho, I hissed. What? He winced, applying a tourniquet high on his arm. Caulfield has millions of dollars of my father's stolen tech, I said, stripping the reflective emergency poncho from Bradley's pack. They are scanning this ridge with military-grade thermal optics. Our body heat is lighting up like a bonfire against this freezing mud. If we don't mask it, we're dead in 60 seconds. I grabbed fistfuls of the freezing, near-slush mud from the forest floor and began smearing it aggressively over my face, my neck, and the exposed parts of my rifle. It was agonizingly cold, but mud is a natural thermal insulator. I covered Bradley in the thermal poncho, completely obscuring his heat signature, and buried him under a pile of dead pine needles. "Stay perfectly still," I whispered, my breath forming white clouds in the freezing air. "Do not move a muscle, no matter what happens." I crawled away from him, moving like a ghost through the icy underbrush. I didn't just want to hide, I needed an angle. The ballistics of cold weather are entirely different from the desert. In Africa, the heat makes the air thin, and the bullet flies faster and higher. But here, in a freezing Polish autumn, the air is dense. It's like shooting through water. The bullet slows down faster. It drops harder. The math in my head shifted, recalibrating to the brutal reality of the Suwalki Gap. And through my scope, I scanned the opposing ridgeline, about 700 yards away. There, a faint, unnatural distortion in the brush. 3 figures, moving in a tactical wedge formation. They were wearing advanced thermal cloaks, but they weren't perfect. I could see the heavy, distinctive barrel of the XM880 protruding from the lead man's camouflage. It was Caulfield. He was hunting me. But he forgot that I grew up surviving a predator. Caulfield stopped near the edge of a rock outcropping. He raised his rifle, scanning the ravine where Bradley and I had been pinned down. He was looking for our heat signatures. He was looking for the easy kill. I was positioned 200 yards to his right, buried in the mud, completely invisible. The cold was seeping into my joints, threatening to make my fingers go numb. I had to take the shot before hypothermia destroyed my fine motor skills. But I couldn't just shoot him in the chest. And despite the fact that he was trying to murder me, I was a sworn soldier of the United States Army, bound by the rules of engagement. If I killed him, his high-priced lawyers would twist the narrative. They would claim I went rogue during a training exercise. I would spend the rest of my life in Leavenworth, and my father would win. I didn't need to kill Liam Caulfield. I needed to disarm him, capture him, and expose the financial pipeline linking him to my father. I looked through my loopholed scope, the crosshairs resting gently on Caulfield's position. He was standing perfectly still, his cheek resting on the stock of the XM880. Target distance, 710 yards. Temperature, 34 degrees Fahrenheit. Barometric pressure, dropping. Wind, 4 miles per hour, left to right, filtering through the pine canopy. Because of the dense, freezing air, I had to dial an extra 1.5 mils of elevation just to fight the atmospheric drag. I placed the crosshairs not on Caulfield's chest and not on his head. I aimed directly for the massive titanium bolt carrier group of the XM880 rifle pressed against his shoulder. It was a target no larger than a deck of cards, partially obscured by his hands, at over 7 football fields away, in the freezing rain. It was a shot that money couldn't buy. It was a shot that required absolute, terrifying perfection. I closed my eyes for one fraction of a second. I let the freezing rain wash over me. I found the natural respiratory pause at the bottom of my breath. My heartbeat slowed, sinking with the falling rain. I opened my eyes. I applied 2.5 pounds of pressure to the trigger. Crack. The recoil pushed back into my muddy shoulder. The flight time was nearly 1.2 seconds through the dense, freezing air. Through the scope, I saw the exact moment the universe balanced the scales. My 7.62mm round slammed directly into the titanium receiver of Caulfield's rifle with devastating kinetic energy. The impact shattered the multi-million-dollar prototype into jagged pieces of shrapnel. The sheer force of the blow violently ripped the weapon out of Caulfield's hands, throwing him backward onto the rocky ground. He screamed, clutching his right hand and shoulder, which had been shredded by the exploding debris of his own gun. His 2 mercenaries froze in absolute shock. They had no idea where the shot came from. They dropped to the ground, scanning wildly, but they couldn't find me. The mud and the cold had erased me from their thermal optics. I didn't fire again. I flipped my radio dial to the emergency NATO guard frequency, a channel Caulfield couldn't jam without blocking the entire continent's air traffic control. Mayday, Mayday, Mayday. I spoke clearly into the mic. This is Staff Sergeant Patterson, U.S. Army Op 4 Element. Sector 4. We are under unprovoked live-fire attack by rogue Apex Solutions contractors. 1 Allied wounded. Enemy commander is neutralized and disarmed. Requesting immediate medevac and military police intervention. Within 15 minutes, the sky above the pine forest roared to life. 2 Polish Mi-24 attack helicopters breached the cloud cover, heavily armed and locking onto the mercenaries' positions. Ground units from the Lithuanian Special Forces and UNS Army Rangers swarmed the ridgeline. Caulfield's men surrendered instantly, dropping their weapons into the mud. When the medics reached us, I finally stood up, the freezing mud cracking and falling off my uniform. I helped Bradley to his feet. He was pale but grinning through the pain. "Hell of a shot, Alice," he coughed. "Hell of a shot." I walked up the ridgeline as the military police were zip-tying Liam Caulfield. His right arm was a bloody mess, and he was staring at the shattered remains of the XM-880 Bravo scattered across the rocks, the weapon that my father had funded with stolen money. The weapon that was supposed to be his ultimate revenge had been destroyed by a single, perfectly placed round from a standard-issue Grunt. Caulfield looked up at me, his eyes filled with pure, unadulterated defeat. He didn't say a word. There was nothing left to say. The fallout was swift and absolute. During Caulfield's interrogation by NATO intelligence, he rolled over on his financial backers to avoid being tried for attempted murder in a Polish military court. He handed over the bank records from the Cayman Islands. The paper trail led directly back to Richard Patterson's prison cell. 3 months later, my father was hauled out of his minimum security federal facility and dragged back into a courtroom. The Department of Justice charged him with funding a domestic terror element and attempting to assassinate a United States service member. The judge didn't show an ounce of mercy. Richard Patterson was transferred to a supermax facility in Colorado. His sentence extended to life without the possibility of parole. The Patterson name, once synonymous with elite defense contracts and billionaire arrogance, was completely erased from the history books. Today, I am a sergeant first class. I don't wear expensive suits. I don't drive a sports car, and I don't care about stock prices. I care about the wind, the elevation, and the soldiers to my left and right. My father told me I was a failure because I chose the mud over the boardroom. But what he never understood is that the boardroom is built on lies, handshakes, and fragile egos. The mud is real. The mud forces you to rely on exactly who you are when the money runs out and the world goes cold. And out here, in the real world, the lowly grunt always has the final word. If you loved seeing how Alice completely outsmarted a corrupt mercenary in the freezing mud and finally locked her narcissistic father away for good, smash that like button. This story proves that true skill, grit, and integrity will always defeat stolen tech and arrogant billionaires. Do you think Caulfield got what he deserved, or did Alice go too easy on him? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to share this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications for more incredible, dramatic revenge stories. See you next time.